say a prayer from the heart. When worries overtake our mind, on a strength we can rely.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from The Bunker, and in this video I will be sharing my thoughts on the May 2019 JW Broadcasting episode, which is hosted by governing body helper Ron Curzan. So without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
Do you sometimes feel completely overwhelmed when life's problems cause you anxiety? Just trying to provide the necessities for one's family can lead to anxiety. At the same time, you might be dealing with a chronic or life-threatening illness, caring for a sick or elderly relative, grieving the death of a loved one, loneliness, a natural disaster, or maybe you're struggling with the devastating effects of past or present abuse. Now, you firmly believe that God's kingdom will fix these problems. But that's in the future. What about today?
So yes, you can see where this is going. Here we have a governing body helper presenting Watchtower's flagship propaganda show, and the chosen topic is anxiety and how to deal with anxiety. He even has the gall to mention that anxiety and trauma can be the result of past abuse. So he's going there, apparently, despite Watchtower's track record with covering up abuse, thus exacerbating the trauma and anxiety of victims. And spoiler alert, I may as well break it to you now. Surprise, surprise, nowhere in this hour-long broadcast is Ron Curzan going to suggest that people who have anxiety or are dealing with feelings of loss and trauma should seek the assistance of a mental health expert or therapist or counsellor. That advice will be absent in this video. Instead, we're going to get all sorts of advice about how people should maintain their spirituality and pray and read the Bible and that sort of thing. So I'm going to try my very best. It's going to be a challenge, but I'm going to try my very best not to completely lose it as we get layer upon layer of ignorance and silliness in response to this very serious issue that Watchtower has chosen to address.
A sister who has struggled with anxiety for many years wrote this: "Anxiety robs me of sleep, impacts my health, affects the way I treat others, and makes me want to give up." She added, "Anxiety is like a monster that lives in my body, somewhere between my heart and my belly. I cannot wait for Jehovah to kill that monster in the new world. But until then, the monster snarls and tears at my insides and tries to take over my life." Can you identify with her feelings?
Of course, those who can identify with those feelings, and I think many will be able to identify with those feelings to some extent. But if there's someone listening to this show who is on the verge of giving up because of those feelings, who feels completely overwhelmed by them, whose quality of life is being impacted by those feelings, what they need is, again, the assistance of a therapist or counsellor. But again, that advice is absent, and I do feel that is grossly negligent on the part of Watchtower. I mean, if someone says that they feel like giving up, I would personally take that seriously in terms of the potential for that person to kill themselves, to commit suicide. That person is in need of the help of a therapist. Again, Watchtower or Ron Curzan is not going to give that advice.
In the Christian Greek scriptures, the word anxious occurs 19 times. The first occurrence is in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Now, Jesus knew that people worried about how to provide for their family. So at Matthew chapter 6 and verse 25, he gave this wise counsel. On this account, I say to you, stop being anxious about your lives as to what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your bodies as to what you will wear. Does not life mean more than food, and the body than clothing? By saying, stop being anxious, Jesus recognizes that anxiety is already in progress. He is very aware of our imperfect nature. He knows that we tend to bring our worries from yesterday, the would-haves, could-haves, and should-haves, and our imagined worries about tomorrow, the what-ifs, to today. But ask yourself, how often have I worried myself sick about what might happen tomorrow, only to find that tomorrow wasn't nearly as bad as I feared it would be?
I think what we've just seen here is a good example of how it's possible to overestimate the wisdom contained in the New Testament, including the words attributed to Jesus. Because let's go back to that verse that's quoted there in Matthew 6:25. On this account I say to you, stop being anxious about your lives as to what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your bodies as to what you will wear. Does not life mean more than food, and the body than clothing? First of all, when we're talking about anxiety, I don't think it's something that you can just order away. I think that if you were to go to someone and say, I'm really struggling with feelings of trauma and anxiety, and I'm on the verge of giving up, the last thing you would say to someone in that situation is, oh, well, you need to stop being anxious. You need to just cut that out. Okay? Mind over matter. Just pretend that your problems don't exist, which seems to be what's being suggested here. Also, concerns about what you're going to eat and what you're going to drink are legitimate concerns, especially living in the time that these words are attributed, living in the first century Palestine, where day-to-day survival was more of an issue than it is perhaps today in Western society, where food is more easily available, even to people who are dealing with extreme poverty. You know, it's legitimate to be worried about where your next meal is coming from. That is a legitimate concern. And yet Jesus is saying, oh, don't worry about that. And he says, does not life mean more than food, and the body than clothing? Well, food and clothing are facilitate life. If you're without food and you're without clothing, especially if it's extreme conditions, risk of exposure and that kind of thing, your life is in danger. So that sentence alone doesn't really make sense. Again, it's quite legitimate to be concerned about your physical needs if your life is hangs in the balance, depending on how well you can meet your physical needs. So this is the sort of, again, wisdom that as a Jehovah's Witness, or indeed any kind of biblical fundamentalist, you are required to respect this. It's just a given that this sort of advice makes sense. But I would strongly suggest that it doesn't. You cannot simply just order away feelings of anxiety. And when you buy into this kind of logic, it results in the sort of nonsense that Ron Curzan has said, where he suggests that being anxious is a sign of imperfection.
He is very aware of our imperfect nature. He knows that we tend to bring our worries from yesterday, the would-haves, could-haves, and should-haves, and our imagined worries about tomorrow, the what-ifs, to today.
I'm sorry, Ron, but concerns about tomorrow are legitimate concerns, especially if these concerns or anxieties are inducing existential dread because you're worried about where your next meal is coming from, or you're worried about how you're going to pay your rent. You do not turn around to people who are having these issues and say, oh, well, this is a sign of your imperfection. You just need to toughen up and stop being anxious.
Jesus also knows that anxiety can have real, sometimes painful consequences. It can stop us from making spiritual progress. Overthinking and overanalyzing our problems can literally shut us down.
Now, I agree that it's possible to overthink or overanalyze problems. I'm not suggesting that there isn't some possibility of people going too far and panicking too much. But what we've just seen here is an admission of where Watchtower's concerns truly lie. They're worried about anxieties impacting on people's spirituality and thus inhibiting them in serving Watchtower. So this is entirely, in my view, selfish motivation on Watchtower's part. If they were truly concerned about the well-being, the mental and emotional well-being of the people watching this, the millions of people who are expected to watch this, they would be advising people who are dealing with extreme feelings of anxiety and loss and trauma to be seeking a mental health professional. They're not doing that because their main concern is themselves, and they know that people who consult an outside party, someone who's independent, someone who can bring a fresh perspective to their situation, there's a chance that they're going to say, well, do you think the problem might be that you have devoted your life to an organization that demands so much sacrifice from you? Do you think that you might be happier if you distance yourself from that kind of toxic influence? That, as far as I can tell, is the main reason why Watchtower is avoiding the fairly obvious advice to seek a mental health professional. They are more concerned about the spirituality of Jehovah's Witnesses, which is why they're instead resorting to saying things like, oh, you need to pray more, you need to read your Bible more, you need to be a better Jehovah's Witness.
How, though, can we stop being anxious? What's the antidote?
Seeking the help of a mental health professional.
Let's consider 4 practical things we can do. First, rely on Jehovah and take one day at a time. Instead of relying on ourselves, rely on Jehovah and take one day at a time.
Wow. Thank you, Ron, for that profound wisdom that you've imparted to those suffering with anxiety and trauma. They need to rely on Jehovah and take things one step at a time. Don't rely on yourself. Don't rely on independent advice from a qualified mental health professional. Just rely on Jehovah's organization and the advice they have to offer, which mostly involves doing everything you can to serve Jehovah's organization.
Daily challenges cause anxiety that can make us forget to rely on Jehovah and take one day at a time. So we need to add our second way to deal with anxiety. Pour your heart out to Jehovah in earnest prayer. The peace of God will guard your hearts. Guard was a military expression referring to troops assigned to protect a city. The inhabitants could sleep soundly, knowing that soldiers were guarding them at night.
It wouldn't be a JW Broadcasting episode without having the definition of a rudimentary word explained to us.
In a similar way, when we have the peace of God, our hearts and minds can rest. This can prevent us from being overwhelmed by anxiety or discouragement. Knowing this should move you to pray specifically, expressing your deepest emotions, and plead that He grant you peace of mind and heart. To the extent you do so, 1 Peter 5:10 promises that He will make you firm. He will make you strong. He will firmly ground you. Never underestimate the power of prayer. Jehovah is always ready to help you, one day at a time.
So obviously I'm no longer religious, and I'm somewhat skeptical about the power of prayer I think that prayer is essentially an exercise in talking to yourself. I don't think that there's anyone listening to the prayer or answering the prayer. I do see how psychologically there could be some benefit to verbalizing what your issues are, even if there is no answer in any meaningful way. At least you're kind of ordering your concerns in your head. Maybe there's some benefit to doing that, but whatever benefit there is to prayer, I think even the religious among you will admit that first and foremost, someone who is in the situation of dealing with intense anxiety, their first priority needs to be, again, seeking professional help. So we're 2 steps into Ron Curzan's suggested method of dealing with anxiety, and we're still not getting meaningful practical advice. I also just can't help but comment on how wooden and fake and robotic Curzan's presentation is. I mean, I guess he can't help it. It just seems to be his presentation style. But he kind of reminds me of, on Star Trek Voyager, you have the emergency medical holographic program.
Please state the nature of the medical emergency.
20 Borg are about to break through that door. We need time to get out of here. Create a diversion.
This isn't part of my program.
If there was to be such a thing as an emergency JW broadcasting presenter who just pops up when everyone else is missing, I think he would kind of look and sound a lot like Ron Curzan. And bless him, he can't help looking so robotic. But the advice that he's giving, especially on such a weighty subject as how to deal with feelings of anxiety, I just can't help but think, no, I'm sorry, you just don't get it. You're disconnected from the severity of the subject that you've taken on. And this is made worse by the fact that as he's talking, Watchtower is flashing up these kind of almost stock images of people just smiling to emphasize the benefits of prayer. Oh, if you pray, you're going to be smiling into the camera like these people who are probably smiling for entirely different reasons than we're suggesting. The whole thing is just so contrived, and yet they are dealing with such a serious issue that in worst case scenario could lead to people taking their lives, and this is their response.
Our third way to deal with anxiety is to read and meditate on God's Word. Let Jehovah speak to you. Allow Jehovah's thoughts to become your thoughts.
Or, to tell it like it really is, allow Watchtower's thoughts to become your thoughts, so that Watchtower can control everything that you think, say, and do. That's what we're really talking about here. Watchtower is not concerned about people reading the Bible on its own terms without any outside influence from them. Watchtower wants people to read the Bible and interpret the Bible the way they interpret the Bible, to turn to Watchtower publications on how verses are to be explained and interpreted. That's what reading the Bible means for a Jehovah's Witness. It's not simply reading the Bible on its own terms and letting the Bible explain itself. It's letting Watchtower explain the Bible and what it means and how the Bible supports the authority of the governing body, which it manifestly doesn't.
Remember, the Bible is how Jehovah speaks to us. Rather than allowing our emotions to run wild, we can learn to focus our mind on upbuilding things.
Apparently, Robo-Ron doesn't want us to let our emotions run wild. Instead, we should focus our mind on upbuilding things, like all of the things that Watchtower wants us to do, think, and say. Again, this is just appalling advice. You do not say to someone who is dealing with anxiety, oh, just don't let your emotions overwhelm you. Gain control over your emotions, suppress them. That is the worst thing that you would say to someone who's dealing with anxiety. You do not just kind of mansplain them into hiding their emotions and pretending they don't exist.
Meditation is the doorway to your heart. Meditation lets God's thoughts affect you on the deepest possible level. Imagine that Jehovah is speaking directly to you, because he is. Never underestimate the power of God's word, of letting Jehovah speak to you.
So when Ron Curzan talks about meditation here, what he's really talking about is self-indoctrination. I mean, when most people think of meditation, what they think, well, let's look at the definition. If I go on Google and Google the word meditate, it says focus one's mind for a period of time in silence or with the aid of chanting for religious or spiritual purposes as a method of relaxation. Jehovah's Witness meditation doesn't involve chanting, to my knowledge, and it certainly isn't for the purpose of relaxation. When Jehovah's Witnesses talk about meditation, they're really referring to that second point there, think deeply about something. So what they want you to do, what they have in mind when they talk about meditation, and what Ron Curzan has in mind, is simply reading the Bible over and over again to yourself, thinking about it, and trying to figure out what it means in terms of your relationship with Jehovah and how you can be a better Jehovah's Witness, based on what it is that you've just read, whether it's from the Watchtower publications or from the Bible directly. That's more or less what they have in mind when they talk about meditation. Again, it's just purely self-indoctrination, and quite frankly, it can be a frustrating process. Because when you're a witness, quite often the material that you're being asked to meditate on doesn't make sense or doesn't really have any great deal of practical benefit. But by going over it and trying to kind of square the circle in your head, you're only adding to the sense of frustration and the feeling of low self-esteem, because you're thinking, why doesn't this make sense? If I were more spiritual, if I had a better relationship with Jehovah, this should make sense. The fact that it doesn't make sense, or I'm not finding a practical value to this, probably means that I'm spiritually weak. It's just this hamster wheel, again, to use that expression, it's this hamster wheel of frustration and disappointment. That's what meditation amounts to in the Jehovah's Witness sense, and this apparently is one of the cures for people suffering from anxiety.
Our fourth way to deal with anxiety is to share your feelings with a trusted friend. Proverbs 12:25 says, "Anxiety in a man's heart weighs it down," or as the footnote says, depresses him. But a good word cheers it up. A good word can come from a fellow believer who is motivated by God's Spirit and guided by His Word. What can you do if you feel weighed down or imprisoned by anxiety? Like Paul, pray for encouragement. Pray for someone you can talk to, someone you can trust with your feelings. The answer to your prayer may be an elder or a mature Christian brother or sister. Even if it takes some effort, never underestimate the power of our brotherhood. Jehovah can use a fellow worshiper to ease your mind of anxious concern. Even at times when there's no one to talk to, we can let the experiences, upbuilding music, and talks on JW Broadcasting be like an encouraging hug from a trusted friend. Yes, when we make the effort, we give Jehovah something to bless. Jehovah can help us conquer the seemingly unconquerable. That may not mean that we'll completely eliminate anxiety, but we can learn to take control.
So, point number 4 on Robo-Ron's magic recipe for dealing with anxiety is share your feelings with a trusted friend. And you hear him say this and you think this would be the perfect opportunity for Ron to say something like, of course, a trusted friend could be someone who is a mental health professional, someone who has qualifications in psychology, or is qualified to help steer you through feelings of loss and anxiety. No such thing. The trusted friend means a fellow believer, ideally an elder, but bottom line, someone who shares your indoctrination as a Jehovah's Witness. This is the grand climax to Ron's wisdom on this subject, to just immerse yourself in the Jehovah's Witness echo chamber. Only speak to people who can validate the beliefs that you have either grown up with or come to be convinced of through indoctrination. And this is going to get you through a mental health crisis, apparently, just speaking to fellow believers. But he obviously goes one step further and says, of course, it could be that you don't have anyone around you or you're on your own for some reason. Well, don't worry, you've got JW Broadcasting. JW Broadcasting can be your trusted friend who embraces you. So the solution, apparently, for someone who is dealing with anxiety that could very well be related in some way to the fact that they are trapped in a doomsday cult, the solution is indoctrinate yourself more with more of our video propaganda. That'll do it.
Earlier, I read a quote from the sister who described anxiety as a monster living inside her. I'm so pleased to say that the sister who wrote that letter about her anxieties is actually here with us in the studio to tell us more about her experience. This is Jordan Williams and her husband, Robert. Thank you so much for coming here to share with us your battle with anxiety. Can you elaborate on that, please?
I feel ashamed of my anxiety. I feel like there's something wrong with me, and I feel guilty about that. I feel like I'm letting Jehovah down by feeling anxious, and that I'm even being disobedient to Jesus when he says, stop being anxious, but I just can't.
Thank you for sharing that. Robert, what do you do to help Jordan battle this anxiety?
It's a monster that sometimes a very stubborn monster that won't go away. Remembering that it's not her fault, that helps me be more compassionate, caring, listening when she's explaining these anxieties that I may not completely understand.
I obviously have no background in psychology. I don't have any qualifications. I haven't even read that much on the subject, but I can only imagine a trained therapist or counselor watching this with their jaw on the floor, just completely aghast at some of the expressions here. You have someone who is battling with anxiety to the point where earlier we heard Jordan had said in her letter that sometimes she wants to give up. Those were her words, that this monster of anxiety that she's battling sometimes makes her want to give up. And here she's actually being interviewed in person, and she's saying that she has feelings of being worthless, or she has feelings of being inadequate because she feels as though she's disobeying Jesus when Jesus says, stop being anxious. This is exactly what I was saying earlier about how you can sometimes overestimate the value of what it says in the New Testament and what it says in the Gospels. It's quite possible that some of the stuff that's written in the New Testament doesn't make sense, and here's a perfect example. You can't just order away anxiety. You just cannot order away depression, and Jordan is only having her feelings worsened and her ordeal intensified by these feelings of worthlessness due to these verses that she's being asked to dwell on.
Jordan, are there other practical things that help you battle anxiety?
The single biggest help is walking with Jehovah every day. I mean that literally. I'll wake up in the morning super anxious and I can't breathe and my chest is tight. And I'll get up and I'll read the chapter of the Bible that the daily text comes from. And then I'll go on a walk and talk to Jehovah for an hour. And I try to use the model prayer as an outline. So I'll talk to Jehovah about his name and how I feel so privileged to have that name on me. And I'll talk to him about his kingdom that's going to solve all of these problems, including anxiety. And I'll talk to him about his will and specifically what his will is for me that day. And most of the time, those three things cover the things that were worrying me. But if there is another thing, I'll talk to him specifically about that.
Yeah, what a nice walk you have with Jehovah. Are there other things that help you deal and battle anxiety?
Personal study projects help a lot, especially if they don't have anything to do with anxiety. If I do a study project on like the spiritual suit of armor or the ransom, it kind of distracts the anxiety monster, so my heart can calm down, and then these pearls of wisdom will come from Jehovah and they can get in. And some of those pearls are actually just what I need to deal with my anxiety.
Are there specific things that help you?
Yes. I made an anxiety tab in the personal study section of my study Bible on my tablet. And I collect scriptures and comments that really help with my anxiety. For example, in 2014, there was a regional convention talk about Matthew chapter 6 and 6 specific things that combat anxiety. And it made me think of like the 12-step program to overcoming addiction. This is the 6 steps to overcome anxiety.
What are those 6 steps?
The first one is to help those in need and then pray a lot, to be forgiving, not to be hypocritical, to store up treasures in heaven, and then to focus on spiritual matters.
So when we got back from the convention, she took those items, she wrote them down and put them on magnets and put them on our refrigerator.
I try to do each one of those 6 things every day. And when I accomplish one, I'll turn the magnet so I can see what I still need to work on.
So when I come into the refrigerator in the morning, if the magnets are turned, we know where she's at. If they're not turned, we know we're in trouble.
It's a bad day.
Time to do something else.
Very good. Nice barometer.
So 2 things are glaringly obvious to me at this point. Firstly, that Robo-Ron is an awful interviewer.
Your battle with anxiety. Can you elaborate on that, please? Jordan, are there other practical things that help you battle anxiety? Are there other things that help you deal and battle anxiety? Are there specific things that help you? That's very precious. Thank you for sharing that. Are there other things that help you deal with anxiety?
That is not how you interview someone. You ask the question, let them explain it fully, and then ask follow-up questions to further clarify some of the points that they've made. It's almost as though, and I'm not saying this for sure, it's how it looks to me, it's almost as though they did actually let Jordan express all of the ways that she fights her anxiety and just interspersed her talking with separately recorded lines of Ron saying, is there anything else? That's how it looks to me. I'm not saying that's exactly how it happened. I have no idea. But all that aside, as far as Jordan is concerned, it strikes me that here is a woman who needs help. And she's not getting the help that she needs through effectively self-medicating with pseudo advice that she's receiving through her religion that basically revolves around reading Bible verses, meditating on things that she's heard at assemblies and conventions, praying. None of these are going to help her long term, and it shows, because it's obvious through her account that anxiety just keeps being this huge monster, is the word that she uses to describe it. It's a monster that's not going away. It's a monster that she's continuing to battle, and a monster that, as we heard earlier, has made her feel on occasion like giving up. So the solution that Watchtower is trying to sell to anxiety, in the case of Jordan, clearly isn't working.
So what can others do or say that would be helpful to those going through anxiety?
For the friends, it's really nice when they're understanding and non-judgmental and respect my privacy. That's really helpful. And when they don't freeze me in time, decide that, oh, she's anxious and this is how she's going to be all the time, that's really helpful. I even forget that Jehovah approves of me. So reminding me of that, reminding me that the things that I do to please him are successful, and maybe even reminding me of things that I've accomplished for Jehovah in the past.
You know, you should tell Ron about your broken dish.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I'd like to know about that.
So I just found out about this Japanese art called kintsukuroi, and it's basically taking a broken piece of pottery and fixing it by putting it back together with gold or silver lacquer. And the concept is that the piece is more beautiful for having been broken. And that really resonates with me because I do feel broken by anxiety. But Jehovah gave Jesus as the ransom, and that ransom is just pure gold. And he can take all the broken, anxious little bits of me and put me back together. And maybe I'll even be more useful to Jehovah for having been broken.
That's very precious. Thank you for sharing that.
This analogy of the vessel, the vase or whatever that's broken and it's repaired using gold. I've heard that before. I'm sure lots of you have heard that. That is, I don't know how you take that as someone who is dealing with depression or trauma or anxiety and think, oh, well, that solves everything. Oh, well, if I'd only heard that before, I wouldn't be feeling the way I feel. That's just the miracle cure for all of the sadness and loss and darkness that I'm experiencing. If only I'd thought of this before, this Japanese thing about putting gold in cracks. Seriously, what we've heard is just fluff, quite frankly. It's not a practical step for helping people with trauma. It's true that if you are struggling with feelings of anxiety, that doesn't make you less of a person, and it could be said that you are stronger for having overcome those feelings. But that's not going to offer you a long-term solution. What's going to offer you a long-term solution is getting help. And again, what is frighteningly apparent from what Jordan is saying is that she's continuing to struggle with her feelings of anxiety because, again, she is self-medicating with pseudo solutions that Watchtower is giving her that basically revolve around immersing herself in her indoctrination, praying more, reading the Bible more, thinking about what she's heard at meetings and assemblies. This apparently is Watchtower's solution to mental health crises.
I've learned to recognize when anxiety is clouding my thinking, and I'll ask him, can I borrow your brain for a minute, please?
So what we did is we went and purchased a whiteboard, put it in my office, and sometimes we'll go to the whiteboard and write out all the anxieties that she's dealing with. As we're writing them out, sometimes we realize those are yesterday's anxieties, and they've been cared for. So we can erase those from the board. Some of them are from tomorrow, and so we don't want to borrow those and bring them today. That's tomorrow's anxiety. And some anxieties can be grouped in little clusters, and you can realize the root is here. Let's focus on that.
I fight anxiety every single day, and anxiety is constantly changing its tactics, so I have to be adaptable. But Jehovah never leaves me to fight anxiety alone, ever. I don't understand what I've done to merit all of his attention, but I do realize that I don't need to understand why he loves me. I trust him, and he never lies. So I just need to accept it when he shows me that love.
We appreciate you sharing those personal feelings. And again, we know that Jehovah and Jesus are so proud of you. And we know that those who are listening into this interview will benefit so much from listening to your personal expressions. Thank you very much.
I don't know how people tuning into this interview, especially those who are struggling with mental health problems, could benefit in any way from what we've just heard. What we've just heard, for me, amounts to denialism, just trying to find reasons why anxieties that do exist don't exist. We heard there Jordan's husband talking about this whiteboard exercise, which just seems to be an exercise in pretending that anxieties don't exist or finding reasons to dismiss them, including on the grounds that these are tomorrow's anxieties. Well, sometimes it's worthwhile worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow. If you know that your rent is due tomorrow, and you know that you don't have the money tomorrow, then these are tomorrow's anxieties, and it's worth worrying about them today, just in case there's something that you can do today to negate that anxiety that's coming tomorrow. So this whole idea of, oh, well, if it's tomorrow's anxiety, we don't have to think about it, seems to me to be fairly naive and indeed reckless, you could say. But it's, again, clear to me that Jordan is not getting the help that she needs, even though she's convinced herself that she is getting help. She freely admits that this is a daily battle. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that it wouldn't stop being a daily battle, even if she were getting professional counselling and perhaps medication for her problems. But at least if she were getting professional counselling, she would be getting as much help as she can get. At the moment, she's not getting any help.
My name is Sting Dot. I was born in 1988 in Darwin, Northern Territory. When I was 8 years old, I realised that life was getting very difficult for me. I was diagnosed with ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, Tourette syndrome, and on top of all of that, I was diagnosed with severe anxiety as well. My mum said this affected the entire family because I would repeatedly yell out good night to each individual person in the family. And on top of that, I used to constantly go around the house checking the locks and the windows. My school life was the hardest thing I'd ever had to deal with. And my school was approximately 500 metres from my home. It would take me at least 2 hours to get to school because one of my obsessions was there was cracks on the footpath, and if I stepped on one, I'd have to go all the way back home and start again. Well, I found life to be a constant struggle, and as I got older, it only got worse. Even at 10 years old, I decided that I wanted to end my life, so it would make everyone in the family's life a lot easier. But then we decided to use some medication, which eased my problems a little bit. Despite having medication, life was still completely unbearable for me. I had a constant struggle every day within myself. I used to wash my hands hundreds of times a day. I couldn't leave the home. I couldn't get a driver's license. I couldn't even get a job. A major turning point in my life was my mum's unwavering faith in Jehovah.
That's not a turning point. That's a factor in Steve's life. I hate to nitpick, but it's odd that he's used that very specific phrase. This is a factor in his life that is going to influence the way he interprets his illness and his difficulties. But I find it interesting during his testimony, he says, oh, we decided to start taking medication. I don't know how you can just decide to start taking medication without going to see a doctor, going to see a psychiatrist perhaps, and having medication prescribed to you. But it's interesting, the word choice. It's almost as though he's been coached to tell his story in a way that completely omits any reference to seeking the help of trained mental health professionals.
On September the 4th, 2010, it was my most important day of my life. I got baptised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses at Adelaide Entertainment Centre. I now serve as a ministerial servant. I've had the privilege of giving public talks, which is something I never thought I'd ever be able to do. I completed Pioneer School after 3 attempts because the Pioneer School environment made me feel like I was back at school and made me have anxiety again. So the 3rd time I completed it, and none of this would ever have been possible without Jehovah's help. On the 6th of August 2016, I married my beautiful wife, Laura, who helps me serve Jehovah, and we can serve Jehovah every day together. I, like the Apostle Paul, still feel like I have a war inside me sometimes. But definitely Jehovah has never let me down. We'll never give up on serving Jehovah, because Jehovah will never give up on you.
Did you notice what Sting considered the turning point in his life? It was the unwavering faith of his mom, the warmth of the congregation, and most of all, help from Jehovah.
Again, those are factors in Steve's story, but I hate to be overly precise, but you can't call those turning points. It would be a turning point if he went from not being particularly interested in his religion to suddenly deciding that he wanted to mimic or imitate his mother's unwavering faith. That would be a turning point. But his mother's unwavering faith isn't anyway. That aside, I just find it tragic that Steve has managed to convince himself that only with, I think he says, only with Jehovah's help could he have overcome his affliction, or at least managed his issues with some degree of success. Well, what's his comparison? How is he able to make that statement? He's been raised as a Jehovah's Witness. He's never known anything other than being a Jehovah's Witness. So how can he say that only by being a Jehovah's Witness has he, for example, managed to stave off suicide, which is something that he refers to earlier in his story? How can he say that only through being a Jehovah's Witness has he conquered his anxieties and managed his ADHD and those sorts of things? He has no point of comparison. Of course, he's going to assume that his faith is what's made everything possible, but then he has to account for the fact that there are people born with ADHD and acute anxiety and autism and any number of mental problems that manage to overcome them without being Jehovah's Witnesses. So what's his explanation for those people? This, unfortunately, well, first of all, it's a man who has overcome his difficulties despite being a Jehovah's Witness, not because of being a Jehovah's Witness. And we have here an organization that is, number one, compounding his problems by giving him false hope, by requiring huge sacrifices of him in terms of his time and his allegiance and his loyalties, even his life, if the issue of a blood transfusion were to come up. And we also have an organization that is exploiting him and using his mental health problems and his afflictions as a tool for manipulating people into thinking that theirs is the only solution to these issues.
He called Jehovah a very powerful friend. That's so true. This month's music video reminds us that we can find peace and joy despite our burdens. It's entitled, "Each Day Has Its Own Anxieties."
I know about the paradise under God's kingdom, and I believe with all my heart that better days will come. But sometimes in this life for me, it's hard to see the things unseen, to feel the love I know is there when my heart is in despair. But I know Jehovah's near. So I say a prayer from the heart. When worries overtake my mind, on His strength I can rely. I'm not alone I know he's there. I have his words of comfort and true friends who really care. Yes, each day has its own anxieties, so I take one day at a time, leave tomorrow until tomorrow. Peace is what I find, one day at a time.
We're not alone, for He is there. We have His words of comfort and true friends who really care. What an encouraging thought from that song. Yes, true friends who share our love for Jehovah are invaluable.
If you say so, Robo-Ron. But gosh, another music video for us to think about there. I actually was recently in America. I was in LA doing a couple of projects, including the Truth About the Truth documentary. And towards the end of the trip, I found myself needing to take an Uber ride. And it was like an hour-long drive. And for the first 15 minutes, the driver was playing songs, or he must have been tuned in to like a Christian rock channel. And it was excruciating, because it's bad enough having to listen to propaganda music in the form when I'm doing the research for these videos, but to also have to listen to it in the back of the Uber. I was so relieved when he changed the channels and there was some normal music playing. But no, I don't need to be manipulated and indoctrinated when I'm taking an Uber ride, thank you. But it's fascinating to hear that song and think that could have been playing in the back of the car that time. That's exactly the music I was listening to. This would fit in seamlessly with a Christian rock channel, and I think that says a lot about the direction that this organization's going in. It's just absorbing elements of quote-unquote Christendom that it once would have made fun of, and it's just rather hypocritically, in my view, just going for it and thinking, what the heck? We'll do televangelism, we'll do Christian rock, we'll do all of the things that we once would have mocked Christendom for doing. But you can see in this music video this family where, first of all, the young lad is being indoctrinated. There's some footage later on in the song where you see this process of childhood indoctrination unfolding far more clearly. You also have, toward the beginning there, the mother who's apparently grieving her husband, and the son comes down, sits down next to her and puts his arm around her. And it's just sad to see Watchtower apparently reveling in this music video in the amount of control it can have over multiple generations.
When an isolated group was established, since there were no brothers, I would wear a head covering and conduct the meetings. Sometimes the outlines were in English. We didn't understand anything. But people were delighted to hear even just the scriptures and went home satisfied. And that strongly impressed on me the power of God's word.
So we're now hearing the testimony of Takaku and Hisaku. Hope I've pronounced those names correctly. These are two older ladies who have basically exhausted their entire lives serving Jehovah, serving Jehovah's organization. We're seeing this now in almost every JW Broadcasting episode, where they show someone who's been at it for decades, and they are using their story to try and manipulate future generations into repeating their mistake. They've been waiting for Armageddon to come for decade after decade after decade after decade. It's never come. Oh, well, never mind, I'll pass the baton on to the next generation and they can repeat the exercise of waiting for this Armageddon that's never coming for even more decades into the future. But it's interesting as well, they mention their head coverings, and I have made a video about this recently because I think that this is a subject that doesn't really get talked about that much, but it's worthwhile for those who don't know much about Jehovah's Witnesses, just emphasizing that they do have this requirement of women wearing a head covering if they are performing any kind of preaching activity in the presence of a male. This is still a requirement to this day. It might have changed slightly since the time period that we're looking at now, but I just wanted to flag that we've heard that referenced in the JW Broadcasting episode, and it's something that most witnesses would just shrug off like, oh, you know, big deal, because they're used to it. But for those who aren't used to it, for those who don't think women should have to wear a sign of subservience on their heads, this is something that's worth flagging.
I had a serious skin condition. I could not bear to look at the illustration of Job in the magazine, and I covered it up with paper. But Jehovah helped me to look to Job's example. I learned that our endurance under trial would become praise to God. I have often had health problems. Just at one of those times, I received a letter from the branch. It said, "What you can accomplish now may be limited. However, think about all that you have done up to now to give praise to Jehovah, about the people you were able to help learn the truth, and be joyful, knowing that you have been used by Jehovah fully." I couldn't stop crying because I really felt the care and concern from the organization and from Jehovah.
When in the letter they said you have been used by Jehovah fully, I would have just slightly changed the wording of that letter. You have been exploited by Jehovah's organization fully. That's what we're seeing here. We see two women who have, again, exhausted their entire lives and don't really have anything to show for it. And we hear there the story of how one of these women had to battle severe health problems. Watchtower gets almost sadistic pleasure, it seems, from there being some element of sacrifice thrown in. It can't just simply be a case of, oh, well, this is easy for them, they're doing this without really breaking a sweat. No, they would rather someone was suffering along the way, because that makes the sacrifice all the more pleasurable for Watchtower and all the more worthy in terms of propaganda value.
Whole-souled service for nearly 20,000 brothers and sisters is a full-time assignment at Bethel. What motivates them to reach out for this special privilege? What blessings do they experience? And what's the best way to prepare and qualify for Bethel service? I'd like to invite my friend Patrick LaFranca to discuss these and other questions. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, Ron. How heartwarming it's been to see millions take their stand for true worship. Thousands more are joining us every week. Jehovah is speeding up the ingathering work, and this makes us very happy.
Jehovah is speeding up the ingathering work, and this makes us very happy. Well, this is just a lie. I'm sorry, you can say lots of things about the ingathering work. You can say lots of things about the results from the preaching work worldwide, but one thing that you cannot say is that it's accelerating. It's kind of stagnating. When you look at the growth percentage for just the last 2 years, for 2 successive years, the growth percentage has been only 1.4%, which is nothing to write home about and essentially means that witnesses are just making babies. That's how they're kind of keeping their heads above water at the moment. They're not bringing in people. There is no huge ingathering work that we can see. If anything, there's a stagnation. So it's very interesting. Well, it's interesting that Patrick LaFranca is now being brought on to extol the virtues of becoming a Bethelite for reasons I'm going to go into later. But it's fascinating that he's doing that by trying to convince witnesses that there is this huge increase going on when there manifestly isn't.
Bethel is a unique place. It's where mature Christians render sacred service to Jehovah in close association with Christ's brothers. They minister to the needs of our worldwide brotherhood and support the preaching work. The Bethel family is a group of dedicated, baptized servants of Jehovah who live and work together closely. We're very pleased to see that many have expanded their service to Jehovah by making themselves available for the special privilege of Bethel service. Have you considered this as a goal?
I find this part of the episode very odd, because what we're now getting is Patrick LaFranca introducing what amounts to a recruitment video for Bethel. And it's odd. If you don't know what Bethel is, by the way, Bethel is the word that's commonly used to describe Watchtower facilities, whether these are the facilities in America, such as the Watchtower Educational Facility at Patterson, the United States branch office at Wallkill, or the world headquarters at Warwick. You also have various branch offices around the world, and they're commonly referred to as Bethel. But it's odd that we're now getting a recruitment video urging mostly young witnesses, mostly young male witnesses, as we're going to see, to sign up to become Bethelites, because it was only recently that Watchtower slashed the number of Bethelites. It was actually on Wednesday, September 23rd, 2015, that a letter was read warning that there would be a huge reduction in the number of Bethelites. As a result of that, there were massive cutbacks. Lots of Bethelites got sent home or assigned to pioneer work, where they were basically forced to fend for themselves. Having trusted that they basically had a career for life at Bethel, they were now getting tossed out and again forced to fend for themselves. Now Watchtower wants to convince us that there's a need and that people should sign up to become Bethelites. If you happen to be one of those thousands of Bethelites that was tossed aside 3 or 4 years ago, you're going to be very perplexed watching this new recruitment video.
Making yourself available for Bethel service is like knocking on a door that leads to many other privileges of service. Of course, to serve at Bethel requires a self-sacrificing spirit and a willingness to serve wherever there is a need, in harmony with the attitude displayed by the prophet Isaiah at Isaiah 6:8. Then I heard the voice of Jehovah saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." When Isaiah learned about an opportunity to do more in Jehovah's service, he responded eagerly, even though he did not know exactly what he was going to be assigned to do.
2 things. Firstly, I find it interesting that they are promoting Bethel by showing mostly the cushy office jobs. It's very rare, I would suggest, from what I know, that you sign up for Bethel and immediately find yourself working in a cushy office job. Most likely, you're going to, for at least a period, be cleaning toilets. But they don't show the Bethelites cleaning toilets there, do they? And it's also, I always cringe when they show a Bible character. They start talking about a Bible character by name, in this case Isaiah, and they show a depiction or a painting of this Bible character as though that's what they looked like. Watchtower has no idea what Isaiah looked like, assuming that Isaiah was indeed a historical character. How do you possibly know what Isaiah looked like? But they have to show something, so they show this image. And it's only a small thing, I know, but I just find it fascinating that they They give you this image, and witnesses are supposed to think, yeah, there's Isaiah. They're literally just showing some guy with a beard.
It was enough for him to know that Jehovah was extending an invitation to serve in a special way, and Isaiah wanted to volunteer. The same spirit is shown by Bethel family members worldwide. What especially motivates so many to serve at Bethel? Love for Jehovah moves us to put kingdom interests ahead of self-interest, as stated in the Proclaimer's book, page 295. This is not work in which they gain personal prominence or material possessions. Their desire is to honor Jehovah, and they are satisfied with the provisions made for them in the way of food, lodging, and a modest allowance for personal expenses.
A modest allowance for personal expenses that, in the case of governing body members, could end up being slightly extended to allow for purchases on a Sunday morning of the alcohol variety. Don't get me started on Bottlegate again. But I hope you also caught where it said that love for Jehovah moves us to put kingdom interests ahead of self-interests. That's what being a Jehovah's Witness is about in a nutshell. Putting the organization's interests first, sacrificing for the organization. Bethelites are just Jehovah's Witnesses who do that by moving to the Watchtower facilities and all living together and working for peanuts, so that Watchtower can produce its literature and produce videos and what have you. It's yet another means for Watchtower to exploit people in the interests of perpetuating this organization, even though the teachings don't make sense, and even though the predictions over many decades have been found to be utterly baseless.
Are there any rewards that come from serving in this unique way? Those who have offered themselves willingly for Bethel service have truly been blessed.
The love and unity we feel here is incomparable. It's not like in a company out in the world, because here you can work with your friends every day.
Like-minded people have the same goals and support each other. That is what you can feel here.
Maybe you are assigned a task that you have never performed before, but there are many experienced brothers and sisters who can help, professionally as well as personally.
Whether it's the consideration of the daily text or Watchtower study with the Bethel family, listening to the practical, valuable comments of our brothers and sisters is really refreshing. You really feel that they love Jehovah, and their comments help you to feel the same.
Here in Bethel, you have the best employer that there is, Jehovah. No other employer is as grateful and considerate as he is. So out of love for Jehovah, you're simply happy to give him your best.
I find it interesting to contrast what we've just seen with the Ex-Bethelites Tell-All series that I'm making. So I've so far only made 2 episodes. I plan to interview more Bethelites in the future, but the ex-witness ex-Bethelites that I've spoken to give a far more rounded picture of what life in Bethel is like. Here in this recruitment video, you're just getting the squeaky clean, oh, everything's perfect, everything's brilliant, it's all so encouraging and so upbuilding, and you really see Jehovah's Spirit in action. And when you speak to actual ex-Bethelites who have realized that they were being lied to and exploited, and as such have since left the organization, what's interesting is that you still get positives. You still get them saying, actually, I had there was a great deal of camaraderie with my fellow workers, my fellow Bethelites. I made some good friends. I miss them. I still care about them. I think about them. We had some good experiences. We had fun together. It's just that I was being exploited. It's just that it's not true. And actually, there were things that happened during my stay in Bethel that helped convince me that this is a man-made organization that's using people. So those are the stories that I think I would personally give more credibility to, rather than just this carousel of talking heads all waxing lyrical about how wonderful Bethel is.
To serve at Bethel, there are qualifications that need to be met. You should have a deep love for Jehovah and the organization, which is demonstrated by living in harmony with Bible standards. You must have a fine reputation as a spiritual person. You should have respect for Jehovah's moral standards, avoiding uncleanness and sexual immorality. You should have a clean conscience before Jehovah and be at peace with yourself and with Jehovah's organization. Your dress and grooming should be exemplary, befitting a Christian minister, even during leisure time. Styles that are faddish or extreme, or that identify us with undesirable elements of the world, are not acceptable at Bethel. The applicant would not read, listen to, or view any type of material that is inappropriate for a Christian. Such unwholesome material certainly would include pornography, debasing music, or any kind of entertainment that features sexual immorality, spiritism, or violence.
So what we're seeing now is this list of criteria for who gets to be a Bethelite. And the first 4 of the 8 criteria for me are the most interesting. The rest aren't really that interesting. They are, are you in good health? Do you speak the local language of the branch office? That sort of thing. The first 4 are more to do with morality and are your morals in line with Jehovah's organization? Are you exemplary? Do you clothe yourself the way that's expected? No tight pants. Do you watch porn? Do you have any sexual practices that would disqualify you from Bethel service? What I've always found fascinating is that these are requirements that are expected of all Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not just Bethelites who aren't allowed to watch porn and are expected to be exemplary in their choices of entertainment, in their dress and grooming and that sort of thing. It's just that Watchtower likes to think that when witnesses join Bethel, they're the cream of the crop. They're the exemplary ones. But if the Pillowgate videos taught us anything, it's that is simply a fantasy. Bethelites are just ordinary witnesses doing their best like any other witnesses. And the very, very specific stories that were told in the Pillowgate videos by way of warning examples would indicate that, if anything, the sexual repression that Watchtower insists on wielding on witnesses manifests itself in some very strange ways when you group a load of witnesses together, mostly sexually frustrated young men. Anything can happen.
With regard to secular skills, we do not encourage individuals to obtain university education or training with the thought that this will improve their chances of being called into Bethel. The best way to prepare for Bethel service is to first serve in the full-time pioneer ministry. The greatest need is for single brothers. However, all who meet the qualifications, including sisters, are encouraged to apply for temporary volunteer service. Serving as a temporary volunteer at Bethel may open the way to other opportunities to expand your service to Jehovah.
So they freely admit in the video that the priority is for single brothers. If you have a penis, you're far more likely to be accepted into Bethel. And they give no explanation. They don't even try to explain why men take priority in terms of their recruitment needs. They also talk about higher education and say, don't you going off to college and university thinking that that's going to give you a leg up. If anything, it's a disadvantage. We'd rather you pioneer instead. So another reminder there of the fact that young people are to limit themselves in their potential, in their opportunities, rather than risk witnesses going through college and university and gaining critical thinking skills and realizing that they're in a cult. Watchtower would instead rather they pioneer, and at least that way there's more of a chance that they will continue to be under Watchtower's influence.
not all of us who have such a self-sacrificing spirit have the circumstances in life to serve at Bethel, but we can encourage others who do. Parents, follow the example of God-fearing parents such as Hannah and Elkanah, who willingly made their son available for expanded theocratic privileges. Continue to place the goal of Bethel service before your young ones and stimulate their interest in the full-time ministry by your example and your positive expressions. If possible, bring them on a tour of World Headquarters in New York, USA, or make arrangements to bring them on a tour of the Bethel in the branch territory in which you live. Such visits can help young ones to witness firsthand the work that's being done at Bethel to promote kingdom interests.
Bring your young ones to Bethel and take them on a tour, and hopefully that will convince them to devote their lives to us when they're a little bit older, when they're old enough for us to use them fully. This organisation is parasitic in preying on young people and trying to exploit them in any way it can, to the extent of, again, telling parents to drag them to Bethel for a fun day out. And I also would love to be a fly on the wall for some of those thousands of Bethelites who got sent home in the last 3 or 4 years due to the cutbacks. And suddenly Patrick Lafranca is here saying, of course, not everybody is able to serve Jehovah in this unique privilege of service. And they'll be there saying, well, we were willing to serve. We were happily serving Jehovah's organization in that capacity. And we got laid off just because Watchtower could no longer afford such a large Bethel family. So why aren't they being asked to return to Bethel? Why is Watchtower instead creating a recruitment video on one of its JW broadcasting episodes, apparently with the aim of bringing in the young blood, having already sent thousands of older Bethelites home and told them to fend for themselves? It's odd, isn't it?
Please be assured that we love you for the willing spirit you show as you continue to reach out in Jehovah's service.
Thank you, Pat. We hope that the information Brother Lafranca shared motivates many more to have the prophet Isaiah's willing and self-sacrificing spirit. So much of what Jehovah provides encourages us to keep busy with spiritual things. For one, we're looking forward to our upcoming conventions. The theme for this year is Love Never Fails. Would you like a preview of the program? Let's take a look.
Love. Is it gone? Have we lost it? Is it the possession of the wealthy? The strong? Or is it somewhere else? At the 2019 Convention of Jehovah's Witnesses, you will learn what real love is, where to find it, how to show it, and have it shown in return. God cares deeply about you, and He wants you to know that in this hate-filled world, love can be found. It is not lost, and that love will never fail.
If there's one thing that Jehovah's Witnesses do not have a monopoly on, if there's one thing that they cannot claim to have in abundance, to the point of using it as in the theme of their conventions, it's love. I've spoken about this before, but this is a very almost insulting title for this year's convention, Love Never Fails. As I've said repeatedly, the love that Jehovah's Witnesses have among them is paper thin, and it vanishes the moment anyone either starts questioning the teachings or simply stops attending, or in whatever way marks themselves as bad association, which can be done in any number of ways, by watching the wrong kind of movies, by dressing in the wrong way, by hanging out with the wrong people. Oh, that brother's bad association. We shouldn't socialise with him anymore. The love dissipates completely, and yet here Watchtower has the cheek to try and convince witnesses, and indeed outsiders, we are a source of love. And I find it fascinating that in this kind of trailer for the convention, it's narrated by a woman, even though none of the talks, I mean, you could be listening to this trailer as someone who's never been a Jehovah's Witness thinking, oh, this is very progressive. You know, they've got a woman narrating. Probably that means that when I turn up at the convention, there are going to be women speaking. No such thing. I actually think it's quite misleading and deceptive that they've done that, because this is a patriarchal, male-centric organization where you only get a voice, you only get an opinion if you happen to have a penis, and yet they're here trying to convince people that women are in any way involved in the information that's going to be presented.
Turkey is a nation of more than 80 million people and a land rich in Bible history. Turkey occupies a unique geographic position, bridging Europe and Asia. It's here that Noah's Ark came to rest, near Mount Ararat, Turkey's highest mountain.
I was in two minds as to whether to include this. This is obviously the part that they have toward the end of the episodes, where they go to a certain country and they have the drone footage of the people waving outside their kingdom halls, just to show how worldwide the organization is. But those introductory remarks and talking about, and Mount Ararat, which is where Noah's Ark came to rest, where's your evidence, Robo-Ron, that ever happened? And again, I realise that this will be jarring for those of you watching who do have a literalist, kind of fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. I would only ask, do some independent research into Noah's flood and see what the archaeological record has to say about that event. Look at what it would entail in terms of the amount of water. Look at what it would entail in terms of the engineering of the ark. Look at what it would entail in terms of the number of animals on the ark, the logistics of it all. How you can go through all of that, and simply the fact that there is no geological record of this event ever happening. How you can look at all of these. The only way of believing that it happened is to ignore all of the evidence, as far as I'm concerned. But if you need any further evidence that this is a fundamentalist, literalist group, then you only need to see those concluding comments about Turkey. This is an organization that has no interest in scholarship, no interest in verifying whether events actually took place. They just take everything that the Bible says on face value, and questioning it is forbidden, to the extent where in a previous episode, David Splain famously told his audience that the Sphinx couldn't be as old as historians say it is, because that interfered with the date of the flood.
The Egyptian Sphinx was constructed around 2550 BCE. Well, the problem is with the date, 2550. The global flood occurred about 200 years after that date. So what are the chances that the Sphinx survived the flood? Unless, of course, you think that that's how the Sphinx lost his nose.
Absolutely shocking approach to history and scholarship. But those were my thoughts on this month's JW Broadcasting episode. Suffice to say, I don't need to repeat myself. This has been a very chilling episode in terms of the approach to mental health. You had multiple opportunities for Ron Curzan to point people who are being tormented by dark thoughts, by despair, by anxiety, by trauma, by loss. He had multiple opportunities to point these beleaguered souls in the direction of much needed professional help. He spurned each and every one of those opportunities because he is nothing more than a puppet. I think hologram actually does it some justice. He's just a mouthpiece for an organization that feels it has all the answers, that steers people away from professional help purely because it's afraid that an outside perspective might lead to people's indoctrination unraveling. So very reckless advice in this month's episode. But I hope that you have found my thoughts in some way interesting. Please don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.